In this interview, I'm joined by Adele Tomlin, Buddhist practitioner, writer, poet, independent scholar-translator of Tibetan Buddhist texts, and founder of dakinitranslations.com. Adele recalls her upbringing in England, training as a barrister, and work as a strategist in the City of London, before a chance meeting with the 17th Karmapa changed her life forever. Adele traces her beginnings in becoming a Buddhist, her studies of the Tibetan language in Nepal, and thriving in the academic rigour of Tibetology at the University of Hamburg. Adele discusses her published works, shares her research and translation process, and explores the implications of the Shentong versus Rangtong doctrines of emptiness. Adele also expresses her frustration with gatekeeping in academia, reveals the reasons behind her founding of dakinitranslations.com, and shares her research into the forgotten female mystics of India and Tibet. So without further ado, Adele Tomlin. Adele Tomlin, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Well, I first heard your name from Dr. Ian Baker, who recommended your work actually in episode 100 of this podcast, alongside the work of Miranda Shaw and Ulrich Krauh. And he referred in particular in that episode to your what I deduced to be your articles. He didn't name them, but your articles investigating the question of who were the female teachers of famous Mahasiddhas such as Saraha and Tilopa and so on. Articles like Unsung Heroes, Mothers of Mahamudra and Source of Saraha's Songs, and Dakini's Truth, Tilopa's Overlooked Female Teachers, and Entering Unconventional Conduct. So he was pointing to that as something, sort of, what was he saying? He was saying, I was asking him, what sort of scholarship at this time was addressing some of the themes that he was discussing in the interview, and he highlighted you there. And he also emphasized in that recommendation that something interesting about your work is you're going back to the source texts and engaging in translations and engaging in investigation of that level of detail. And he found that to be very noteworthy. So I'm very pleased to be talking with you.
Yes, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. And thanks to Ian Baker, if he was the inspiration for this. And yes, those female teachers and lineages, Ian and I have spoken about as well, about these kinds of issues. And in terms of Miranda Shaw, for example, I'm actually quite a big fan of her book, even though I wouldn't say in terms of sort of academic scholarship, people would sometimes criticize it. It lacks that sort of thoroughness. Nonetheless, the ideas that she has in that book and the content of the sort of ideas of trying to bring to life more of these women who've been kind of forgotten about or made invisible, I think is really valuable and still really important. So some of the articles I wrote about that were really also to bring out Miranda Shaw's work, because I really believe in also supporting other women, other female scholars and translators whose work has kind of also been overlooked or forgotten about. So I see that also as kind of part of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and I hope we'll discuss those themes as our interview progresses. First of all, I'm curious though about your background, to contextualize, your work and what you're doing. What was your background? What was the context of your upbringing and your early years?
Yeah, so without obviously divulging too much, I'm from England, and I would say I had quite a normal sort of background, nothing sort of really exceptional or extraordinary. I had a happy childhood, and I would say I was pretty English, whatever that means, So I don't really know what more to say about that, but kind of I would say it's quite ordinary background, really.
Two of the tracks that I'd hope we might discuss a bit. One was your educational journey, which has been quite interesting actually. Ending up in the subjects, but certainly not beginning in the subjects that you're working in now. That's one journey, and the other journey you mentioned, of course, offline when we were talking, that you're also a practitioner, not just a scholar in these things. I'm also curious about that personal religious journey into
Yes.
contact with the tradition. So I don't know how best to proceed down those two lines, but I'd like it if we could discuss some of those things.
Sure, definitely. Yeah, well, as I said, I'm kind of from a sort of classic, sort of ordinary English background. My family are not Buddhist. They are still not Buddhist. And that's fine, But in terms of my own development, I was, it's quite sort of common or traditional to sort of want to go to university and to improve one's sort of standing or kind of, get a nice job, all sort of very ordinary, normal things, right? And so I was good at school. I got really good grades. And so it was, considered to be great to go and study law. And I very much kind of went along with that. And, my family were, my parents were happy about that, obviously, because people think if you study law and you're a lawyer, you get good salary and status. And, it was all like that. And so then I went to study law. I did a law degree and I trained as a barrister in London. And, I like advocacy. I was very interested in advocacy and helping others. And but the thing is, my sort of interest in advocacy, when you start as a barrister, you're sort of starting to represent, criminals and people who are actually quite difficult to relate to and empathize with. And on top of that, have done maybe some not very nice things as well. And it can be quite difficult. And as time went on, after I trained as a barrister, I also started to feel this was not really for me. And it was not really what I felt was my vocation in life. I think it was about a year after I qualified, actually. And so I just decided to go into the city of London. So, I was surrounded by people whose whole idea of success in life is to get a great job, get a lot of money, and have a good time, right? Now, this is very common worldwide. I don't think this is particular to, the UK, but, I was very much on that kind of path. And I thought, yeah, this is what I want. And, but then about 2 or 3 years into working in the city, I was working as a strategist. I also felt kind of a little bit, not depressed, but I was kind of very disillusioned with it all. I started to sort of see and look at the people around me and think, is this really it? Is this what this is all about? Is this the rest of my life? Just earning money and buying nice things? And it just felt very pointless to me. And so I started to study yoga quite a lot. And I decided to leave the job and return to university and do a master's in philosophy. I got very interested in looking at philosophy and what was the meaning of life. And I started to practice yoga a lot. And doing those two things, doing the master's in London on the philosophy, which was Western philosophy at that time, and then doing yoga, I decided to go to India for the first time to study yoga. And that was when I met my first spiritual teacher and guru, if you like, the 17th Karmapa.
And I believe it was in India you qualified as a yoga teacher too. Is that right?
Yeah, so I went there to study yoga, to qualify as a yoga teacher. I was really trying to just change my whole direction in life, to being a yoga teacher, to perhaps even being a professor of philosophy. So after I completed the master's, I was kind of set on doing a PhD, and I was really set on that. And then when I went to India to qualify as a yoga teacher, I then met the 17th Karmapa. And this was really a meeting of, I would say, something like, it's a cliche, but they talk about, previous lives, or sort of someone that you just meet and you kind of just know that this is someone that I have a very strong connection to and want to sort of follow. And when I went to India, I was a bit like a backpacker in a way. I was going to study yoga. It's my first time. And my friend and I, on the plane over, I bought this book by Mick Brown, who's a British journalist, called The Dance of 17 Lives, which was about the 17th Karmapa and the current one. And I was very fascinated by it, like an outsider on the plane. It was like, wow, they say this man is a living Buddha. And I had no contact with Tibetan Buddhism prior to this, and I was very fascinated by his story. So I decided after the yoga ashram course that I was going to go to Dharamsala, and I was going to try and meet this the Karmapa, who was residing there at the time. And so that was my plan, and I did get to meet him in a public audience. That was the first time I met him, and my friend came with me, who was also not Buddhist and not interested in Buddhism, and so I just met him very briefly at the public audience, and he looked straight into my eyes, and I just felt my heart burst open, and I really felt, wow. And then after the audience was very, very quick, on the way back in the taxi, my friend said, oh, that was so boring. What was that all about? And I was like, just completely bowled over. I mean, it was just a completely different experience. And I guess that's the kind of thing they talk about when they talk about karma, or they talk about merit, is all of a sudden people have these very different experiences of the same people. But then the following day, I was sitting in a cafe on my own in MacLeod Ganj in Dharamsala, and a monk came down to sit next to me. I'd never met him before, and he just said, oh, you should go and see the 17th Karmapa. And I said, what do you mean? I've already seen him. And he said, no, you should have a private audience with him. And I was like, what? Because I'd never even thought you could get private audiences. I didn't know anything about it. I was a real newbie. And so then he just gave me this phone number. I said, yeah, you can ring up, you can ask for an audience. And so I did. And because Mick Brown had said in his book that if you get a chance to take refuge with someone who's a head of a lineage or a very highly realized practitioner like the 17th Karmapa or and so on, you should just go for it. Because if you really feel that level of devotion, if you get that chance, you should do it. So I called this number and I said, actually, I would like to meet the 17th Karmapa, and I would like to take refuge with him. So those words came out of my mouth, and next thing you know, so the day I was due there, some people had said, oh, no, it won't be you, it won't be on your own. And I turned up, and I was on my own, and I went in, and at that time I don't speak any Tibetan, but he didn't actually give the refuge vow, so he just said he couldn't do it that day, and you have to come back. And I was like, oh. And because my flight was due back to London, and I thought, but I can't come back. And then I thought, so what am I going to do? And then I thought, well, I have to change the flight, obviously. So I changed the flight, and then the next time I went again, I was on my own, and he gave me the refuge vow, and it was it was very simple and quite short, but I was on my own with him, with his translator, and I would say that this moment in my life was a kind of pivotal moment, because from that moment on, when I went back to London, I just decided that this was going to be my life from now on. So I was going to return to India, I was going to study Tibetan, I was going to go and see him teach. And so from that very short moment in time, what some people may have regarded as really relatively nothing, for me was a really pivotal moment. And the fact that I had that opportunity to take refuge with him, and he was the first Lama I'd ever met, and he was the first Lama I ever got refuge vows from. And I understood what refuge was at that time because I'd read Mick Brown's book. So thanks, Mick Brown, if you're watching. But it was just a coming together of causes and conditions that then completely led me to completely abandon my life in London at that time, which on the outside people would have thought was very successful. I had a very wealthy boyfriend in the city of London. I was a kind of a strategist, or but I mean, obviously I was doing a master's in philosophy as well, but I was just completely bored with it all. So anyway.
how did people react in your life when you announced that and made such a drastic change?
Yes, well, surprised, I think. I mean, fortunately, my family, are just very liberal. They generally support what I do. They very rarely say, "Oh, no, 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 that's not okay." So in that respect, I'm very fortunate. My family don't dictate to me, what to do. And so from their side, there was no sort of objection. But obviously, I did have a relationship and that ended. And I decided to, start going to India and started to study Tibetan.
Right. So, okay, you right away associated the language, learning the language, with your religious conversion. So, if we were to go back to
Yeah.
Adele at that moment, that pivotal moment in London, about to set out
Mm.
to India, of course, there
Mm.
are many ways to learn, or some ways anyway, several ways to learn the Tibetan language. Um,
Yeah.
so, how did you go about selecting? Well, first of all, why did you think that was so important to do right at the beginning? And why? How did you go about selecting how to do that? And then what
Mm.
what happened next?
Well, I guess also I wanted to be back in India or back in Asia as well, because I wanted to spend some time with this teacher, the Karmapa. So that was also very much motivating me to get back there, because I wanted to be around him. I wanted to go to his teachings. I wanted to see him again. Yeah, I was completely hooked into his, what they call like the hook of compassion, or the hook of sort of, connection from a past life, is that, you're kind of just, this is like something you have to do. And so then I realized that the way I would also become closer to the guru would be obviously if I could speak his language, because he was then teaching in Tibetan. He didn't know any English at that time. And most of the teachings are also given in Tibetan. And I just felt that to be able to get that direct and to be able to speak to him directly in his language, or in the language of the Tibetan Buddhist Dharma anyway, was just so important, because it's so much more direct, right? Because I don't have to then go through a second person. So that was my prime motivating factor in this. I was not setting out to be a translator. I was just setting out to become closer to the teacher and closer to the actual Dharma, the text, So that's why I wanted to study the language. And how did I go about looking? Well, I sort of looked at, which were the sort of schools, and there were quite a few then. But I did decide to start in Nepal at Rangtong Institute. And the reason for that was that it's actually quite pricey. And most people, will say that it's actually quite pricey. It really is kind of quite pricey, I think, compared to other options. But the reason I started with them is because they have sort of Western teachers who can really teach Westerners, or sort of non-Tibetans, the language in a sort of, I felt that was kind of a good entrance into it, rather than going directly into a sort of with a Tibetan teacher or native Tibetan speakers. And in a way it was very good. It kind of sets you up very nicely with that foundation to then go off and study in sort of maybe not so exclusive or pricey places, but just kind of with native Tibetans more, So that's how I chose that, because they're very much geared to foreigners at that institute.
I know that they offer a range of programs there, from bachelor's, well, I suppose from module study up to bachelor's and beyond, masters and so on, different masters they offer there. What sort of course of study did you pursue? Did you focus mainly on the language, or did you also do Buddhist studies credits and so on?
It was Tibetan language, classical and colloquial. And at that stage, that was what I was set on studying, because I felt that by doing that first, then I could approach the philosophy through the Tibetan texts. And that's what I wanted to do. So at that point, I wasn't studying Buddhist philosophy. But at the same time, when I was not in Nepal, when I was in India, I was attending teachings of the 17th Karmapa regularly. He was giving like these kind of public teachings to quite small groups of foreigners then, who would go to his monastery in Dharamsala. at that time, he was very accessible, actually. It was easy to get private audiences. It was easy to sort of be in a teaching with sort of maybe 40, 50 other people and just watching him teach. So it was a really kind of amazing time. And I felt very fortunate to be there. So I was kind of studying Buddhist philosophy at the same time, but just not within the Rangtong Yeshe Institute itself. Yeah.
Yeah. What sort of years were we talking here?
That was around 2000. So I started studying Tibetan around 2006, 2007. And so, yeah, that was kind of when I started going to India and Nepal. And so, yeah, that was great.
Of course, we're going to be talking about your translations, your translation work. So that's one of the reasons I'm really curious about your language learning journey with Tibetan. So how did you find it when you first contact with the language, and what were your initial impressions, and how did you find it? Did you find it accessible, or difficult? Some people say it's difficult. Other people say they feel
it is.
Yeah,
it is. I mean, one thing I would say is it depends again, because I remember when I was at Rangtong Yeshe, and a lot of people really struggle with it, and I mean, I found it quite easy. I sort of picked it up. I remember sort of words, it was just like, I didn't have to study or revise hard. I was just like, it just came very naturally. And I sort of, and I felt that this was a karmic thing. I felt this was a previous type life thing, because other people really struggle with it. They spend years with it, and it's really difficult. And for me, I was actually became quite a lazy student in a way, because it was just so natural. And I loved it. It was very, I don't know, I just felt like I'd done it before.
You've said that a few times now, the sense of past life connection with the Karmapa, and now you've brought it up again in the context of language. On your site, you also mentioned that some Jonang lamas have suggested that you're the reincarnation of Kunga Trinley Wangmo, 16th, 17th century figure.
Yeah, I mean, some lamas have said this to me, not just Jonang lamas, when I was doing some translation of Kala Chakra, or and sometimes, I mean, I generally always take that with a bit of a pinch of salt. I really don't, I don't know who I was in a past life, but generally this is this life now. And I sort of feel that sometimes with these things, they can give people a little bit of an ego trip. And I feel like sometimes when people say these things, sometimes it is good to sort of take it a bit with a pinch of salt, because you don't want it to become like a sort of ego trip and a kind of barrier, actually, because this can happen very easily. This is a big pitfall, actually, that one has to really look out for, actually, that even if I were, I think it's probably better not to sort of really think too much about it,
Yes, that's very interesting. Well, no, it is very interesting. Are there any, perhaps this is a teacher-student private sort of matter, but did the 17th Karmapa, has he ever intimated to you any past life connection or anything of that nature? It's just interesting to me because you've brought it up a couple of times, and it seems to, this sort of karmic connection seems to be actually quite crucial to your relationship to the 17th Karmapa, and also it seems now to your study of the Tibetan language.
Yeah, I mean, people sometimes who are not Buddhists have some issue or difficulty understanding karma, or the notion of karma, right? And they, especially non-Buddhists, I think they really see this as kind of a belief and a religious belief. I mean, I must say, I don't regard Tibetan Buddhism as a religion, even though other people might regard it as that. I regard this as a very sophisticated, highly advanced sort of form of practice, if you like, mind training practice, which is about coming to a much fuller awakened level of being and state, of a Buddha, or awakening, which Buddha means awakened one, right? So with the sort of karma, this can easily get sort of misunderstood as a kind of a religious belief, but it really, in a way, it's quite simple. It's like, for example, in a family, there can be quite different children, right? So one child could be like an absolute genius on the piano, and everyone else in the family has no interest in music, or they're not as talented. And for example, in my own family, I'm the only one who's interested in Tibetan Buddhism, for example, really. So now those things, science struggles to explain. And in fact, they cannot explain that. They cannot explain these differences because you grew up in the same family, you grew up with a similar kind of environment, similar kind of influences. So for me, as the child prodigy on the piano is, I think, very good evidence of previous lives and karma, because what other kind of explanation would there be for that? I mean, they say genetics. Well, what does that mean? So when I talk about it, I'm talking about it in that sense that there are some things that are quite clearly in our lives just seem to be resonating or sort of making fitting, or we find much easier than others. And this is sort of, if you believe in the sort of continuity of consciousness, or you believe that there is the potential, at least for previous lives with different bodies, then that makes a lot more sense in a way. Why would someone find it so easy to learn Tibetan compared to someone else who's really struggling with it? So that's kind of what I mean there when I say that. It's more like my friend, when she met the 17th Karmapa, didn't feel anything really, she thought it was kind of boring. And, whereas I was just completely overwhelmed and touched and just very moved by what I felt was an embodiment of great compassion, and someone who's living a very different life to the vast majority of people. So,
Yeah, very interesting. Are there other, aside from your connection with 17th Karmapa and your natural affinity with the Tibetan language, or relatively speaking anyway, I'm sure you also had to work at it.
Yeah, I did actually.
Yeah, of course. Are there any other experiences that give you that same sense? Certain other meetings, perhaps, or other paths you've taken since the point we've been discussing?
Sorry, I'm not quite unsure what you're saying. Can you say that again?
Sure. I'm wondering if, in addition to your relationship with 17th Karmapa, that special connection, which has that sense of, karmic connection, and your affinity with the Tibetan language, which also you said has a sense of, karmic connection to it. And I know you're not making too much of that, but are there other if we take that karmic connection thread, of which now there are strung two beads, are there any other beads of that would fit onto that thread? For example, people you've met, or texts you selected. I saw this text and I thought I must translate this, or I encountered this teaching and I thought this teaching is like it's got landing strip on it. I have to deal with this teaching, or this location. I must be at this location. Things of that nature. The answer, of course, could be no.
Well, the thing is with these things, that often they happen quite naturally, I find. So, you're not kind of looking out. It's kind of, these things happen along your way. And so after I'd been studying Tibetan in India, and after I'd sort of been attending quite a lot of teachings with the Karmapa, I decided that it would be good and give me a bit more substance potentially to go and study Tibetology as a master's degree in Europe, which I did in Hamburg. And the thing with that is that why Hamburg? Well, Hamburg, I mean, it's not sort of the first place that springs to mind, but the reason why I chose Hamburg was certainly within Europe. It's considered to be one of the best places, one of the top places actually to study Tibetology. And they did an international master's, and it's in English as well. So I decided to go and do that and use the Tibetan skills that I'd already got in India and Nepal, and studying all the teachings there to get the master's. And so from the master's degree, I contacted a couple of people. I asked a professor called Matthew Capstein, who's a very big Buddhist studies scholar. I don't know if you're probably aware of his work, right? And he suggested, this small text by Taranatha's commentary on the Heart Sutra. And I was very interested in all the emptiness, the philosophy on emptiness, and I was very interested in the Heart Sutra. And so this seemed like a really good text to do. And so I did that. That was my thesis. And I did a brand new translation of it, a critical edition, they call it. And it's very dry and boring. I mean, academic is not like in India or Nepal. You're going to these teachings and empowerments, and it's very sort of exotic, and these Tibetan lamas, and you've got all that Vajrayana bliss and everything. And then you go into Hamburg, and it's a very, traditional university department. And it's kind of like you feel the life energy of it is just completely sucked out of it, And so the first 3 months, I really struggled with that. And I really felt this is way too academic. This is way too dry. But then as time went on, I began to sort of see and understand the importance, actually, if you're going to do any kind of research or translation within Tibetan Buddhism or within the Buddha Dharma, let's say, it actually does require some rigor and some training and some discipline. It really isn't. I mean, the problem is now when you've had that background and you see the translations that are out there where people have not had that and they've not gone through that kind of process of training and rigor, you kind of become more critical because you're actually starting to understand that actually this is not such a great translation because they haven't gone into the source text that much. They haven't really looked at sort of different versions of the same text. They haven't really sourced anything properly. And sure, when translations first started, maybe 30, 40 years ago, people didn't do that, and we shouldn't expect them necessarily to be able to do that. But now I think it really is important, and now I sort of feel that actually there's a lot of stuff out there that probably is not that reliable, actually. And I've read people's translations, I won't say who, but I'm just sort of like, this doesn't actually bear that much resemblance to the Tibetan or the meaning, and people are using these texts. So, and, I'm not going to mention names, obviously, but, it's just, that was the usefulness of the academic background and training, is because they take that sort of thing really seriously, maybe too seriously. They're kind of too sort of academic and dry about it all. But what I felt after doing that was that somehow I was going to try and bring these two worlds together more. The academics see themselves as kind of very separate from all this practitioner nonsense, It's like, oh, they're practitioners, but we're scholars, And I sort of felt that there is absolutely a place for a scholar who's also a practitioner. And even though academics might not sort of see that as relevant, I actually think it's really important that when I read a text, especially if it's a Vajrayana text or it's about a practice or something connected to practice, for example, I've read some research some people have done on consort practice, right? And as I read it, I was like, I mean, it's just so obvious they've never ever done consort practice. And I just sort of feel that it's like almost reading someone describing the taste of chocolate. It's like he's never tasted it. It's like, you can write all you like about the taste of chocolate, but at some point you really do have to taste it, because when you write about the taste of chocolate and you haven't tasted it, it actually is quite obvious that you haven't, actually, to someone who has tasted chocolate. That's how it felt to me. So I felt that, it's the same with the academics and the scholars who haven't got necessarily the empowerment, they haven't necessarily got the lineage, they haven't even got a connection to the author or the teacher, but they go ahead and they translate these beautiful, profound texts, and they don't think that's important. But I honestly do think it is. And I honestly think that there's something a little bit lacking if you don't have this, especially Vajrayana texts, if you don't really have that blessing or lineage or whatever one you call it, of a sort of, and almost like a reverence for the text, for its content. And, if you're going to write about practicing consort practice or Karma Mudra, I mean, come on. I mean, this is a highly secretive practice. It's really generally only done in a one-on-one sort of teacher-student relation. And if you are going to dare to write about that, well, I mean, come on, at least having actually tasted that or had that experience, I think this is really, really important. So.
Very interesting.
So the Taranatha commentary, sorry, in terms of the text, I forgot to say, that was, so then after I finished the master's, this text was I got a very good result. I got a first-class result for it. And I then asked the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, who I'd been studying Tibetan with as well, if they would publish this as a book, and they said yes. And so again, that was then published as a book. And so from that, then the sort of world of publishing and writing and translation started really opening up for me. And that's when I started to realize that I now had more of a platform to do other work and other translation. And because I'd basically done the Taranatha text, then I got more involved with Taranatha, who's like a Jonang lineage, and also the Kala Chakra, because Taranatha's the Kala Chakra master. He's a Jonang lineage master. And so then I got more interested in that. But always, right from the, I was very much connected to Kagyu. So I always felt that my heart was very much with Kagyu and with the Karmapa. And so even when I was doing Kala Chakra, for example, I got very interested in how the Karmapas were connected to Kala Chakra and how the Kagyu were connected to Kala Chakra. And so, and that isn't spoken about that much, it's not really, Kala Chakra is not really associated with the Kagyu or the Karmapas, right? It's normally very much associated with the Dalai Lama and the Gelugpa, right?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And your thesis, as you pointed out, was published in 2017 by Library of Tibetan Works and Archives as Taranatha's commentary on the Heart Sutra, with a foreword by Professor Matthew Kapstein, as who you mentioned there. You're speaking there, you're pointing to scholarly rigor and philology, the importance of that, and also the importance, in your view, of the practitioner's connection to the material. And so I'm wondering if you might address those themes in Taranatha's commentary on the Heart Sutra, because of course I presume, from if I've understood you correctly, in translating that you were also learning how to approach a critical edition, how to include those more scholarly philological aspects, as well as producing the translation. It was doing your master's. So I'm wondering if you might orient us a bit with that text, and how what challenges did you face with it in philologically speaking, or as a practitioner, and how did you begin to work out your own way of balancing those two perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, philologically, that's quite a difficult word to say, but I actually, it wasn't as difficult as some texts. Like, for example, some texts have like 20 different editions of the same text. Unfortunately, Taranatha's text was not like that. So it was a manageable sort of editions. It wasn't a big number of editions. And so the critical edition, obviously comparing those and contrasting them, was not that difficult. But where I would say it was more difficult, but also very interesting, was the philosophical content. And but also the, if you like, the historical or intellectual import of that text, which was actually at that time, in that time of history, as you probably are aware, the fifth Dalai Lama and the Gelugpa pretty much took over Tibet. They basically took over a whole load of monasteries, Jonang, Kagyu. They took a lot of texts and sealed them up. They were never sort of spoken about or taught again. I mean, this is a widely known thing now, but and the Jonang and the Shentong view, which is the empty of other view, which Taranatha's commentary is very much teaching. It's essentially a Shentong, empty of other commentary on the Heart Sutra, which even now is kind of a little bit sort of controversial, let's say, and some people would adamantly say absolutely not. It's not possible for the Heart Sutra, which is the second wheel turning of Dharma, to be talking about the sort of ultimate view, the empty of other view, or the Buddha nature view, whatever you want to call that. So I can imagine at the time when Taranatha wrote this, this probably would have been incredibly provocative. And when you're sort of also in a sort of environment where, you know, people are very, very set on the sort of the other Rangtong view, the empty self view, and they are not so accepting of this kind of other type of view, which is more focusing on the ultimate nature, the Buddha nature, to say that, you know, the classic Prajnaparamita text of the Heart Sutra is actually teaching that Shentong view. I mean, it probably, some people were deeply provoked by it. And they do say that the takeover of Tibet by the Mongolian army, obviously with the at the helm, you know, the Dalai Lama, was not motivated philosophically, that it was a power thing. But nonetheless, there are things which I brought out in the introduction which suggest that there was actually, it was connected also to this kind of philosophical difference, and the fact that, you know, predominantly Kagyu, Nyingma, and obviously Jonai were very much proponents of the Shentong view and of this empty of other views. So I think there was part of it. It was definitely, and why would they, you know, why would all these texts be taken and sealed and bound up and people told never to study or read them again? You know, I mean, there has to be a reason for that, right? So that's not just a political thing, that's an intellectual thing going on there, I think. When it was published, you know, even then, I remember a Tibetan said to me, "Oh, so you're a Shentongpa now, are you? You're an empty of other person, are you now?" And this person was a predominantly a Gelug person. And even that, I sort of said, well, actually, I wouldn't classify myself as that, although I do actually kind of really understand that view. And I think it's a really, I kind of would say I followed that view, but the book itself was really representing what Taranatha said. And so what I did was I tried to represent as accurately as possible what Taranatha wrote. But the fact that, you know, there was this assumption as well that because I translated a text by Taranatha that was on the empty of other view, that somehow automatically made me, you know, a supporter of that was also very interesting, I thought, you know, because it doesn't necessarily follow, right, that, you know, one is also following the same view. Although in my case, it is true. I do sort of generally follow and accept the Shentong view, yeah. So.
Yeah, it's very fascinating what you're saying. I wonder if it might be possible to lay out a little bit the difference between the Shentong, Rangtong, perhaps for the layman. Why is it important? And how does Taranatha read the Shentong from the Heart Sutra? What's his main line? What are his main lines of arguments? Perhaps that's too much to ask you, but it'd be very interesting if you could.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I also think that other people who are not so familiar with that vocabulary are also interested to hear that, right? This is one of the common questions I also get asked. You know, can you just say in a nutshell what the difference is between Rangtong and Shentong? And actually, was it Einstein who said, if you can't explain, what is it? If you can't explain something difficult in a simple way, I can't remember the exact quote, but basically I think he was just saying that, you know, ideally one should really be able to explain even quite complex ideas in a simple way, right? Now, on the one hand, the Shentong view is actually very, very simple. What it's saying is that if you, for example, the Rangtong, the empty of other view, is saying that all the phenomena around us, that is a sort of conditional phenomena, let's say, or impermanent phenomena, including our bodies, including our minds, including, our consciousness, let's say, or including our notions of self, are all empty of any kind of inherent existence. They don't have any kind of solid existence. So tables, chairs, other people, these are kind of, we just take them as being very solid and very separate from us. But if we analyze and break it down, we break it down in terms of sight or hearing or consciousness, or, you know, now, of course, we have quantum physics to do this for us, but, you know, we can break down a table now and say, yeah, it's actually just atoms. And what are atoms? They're predominantly space. So, and obviously the views on emptiness were all done before quantum physics and before there was this kind of proof of that, right? But they were saying kind of the same thing, that the empty of other view, the Rangtong view, is saying, these objects that you think are so solid and so real and so separate are actually predominantly space, and we are actually not that separate from them. So that, and they don't exist inherently. They're not this kind of solid thing. And so that's the Rangtong view, that's the empty of other view. And that's a very important philosophical view on the path to understanding the view, or the view of emptiness, let's say. So now the Shentong people were saying, okay, we accept that 100%. We're not disagreeing with that. But there's something missing here. That, well, what's left after that then? Because if everything is empty of inherent existence, well, what about all these Buddha qualities that are spoken about in the Buddha Nature Sutras? You know, when you attain awakening, about all these Buddhahood qualities of love, compassion, wisdom, omniscience. Well, where's all that? Because there are many sutras which talk about these qualities, and these are like innate qualities of the nature of mind, right? So the Shentong people felt that this just saying that all phenomena, conditioned phenomena, are empty of inherent existence doesn't really address those other sutras which are talking about the sort of ultimate nature of mind and those incredible, vast, amazing qualities of having a fully aware, open mind of a Buddha, let's say. So Shentong then said, well, yes, Shentong, empty of other. What is, so emptiness is basically all these kind of conditioned phenomena. That is what is the emptiness of inherent existence there. But Buddha nature, or the ultimate nature, or the nature of mind, is not empty of inherent existence. That is there. So they're saying that's not empty of inherent itself. And you know, some of the Jonang even went so far as to say that's permanent, you know, which obviously, you know, troubled a lot of the Rangtong people. The word permanent really shook people. But what Dolpopa and the Jonang and the great Kagyu Lamas were saying as well, you know, like the third Karmapa, when we say permanent, it's like this is kind of beyond conditioned phenomena. So the nature of mind, or Buddha nature, is something that is unconditioned, and it's fundamentally present in the nature of mind. And this is what awakening or becoming a Buddha involves. It involves revealing that essence, if you like, or revealing that nature of mind, which is always present. So that is a Shentong view. So the Shentong view is saying, you know, yes, everything around us, that is all empty of inherent existence. But in terms of the essence or nature of mind, or those great Buddha qualities, which, you know, that's the whole point of awakening, that is not empty of inherent existence. That is something that is kind of eternally present, actually. And that's the sort of thing when they say we are all actually already Buddhas. It's, again, quite a provocative statement, but what it's trying to say is, of course, we're not Buddhas because we have a lot of afflictions and delusions and a sense of self and other, but we're already Buddhas means that we all have within us that potential, which is eternally present, which is the sort of Buddha nature qualities within the mind. So that, I guess that wasn't really a nutshell, but hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of the difference between a Shentong view and an empty of other view. Was that clear?
Yes, very much so. Thank you. And two questions I think arise from that. What are the implications then of that view, of that difference in view? And also, how does Taranatha approach the Heart Sutra in that Shentong way?
Yes. Well, I could say, oh, go buy the book, but but it's, yeah, I mean, obviously I go into a lot of detail in the book, but you know, seriously, what is the practical import, let's say? Is that what you're asking? So what is the point of knowing the difference? Is this just a philosophical, intellectual, you know, interesting thing? But what is the actual point? Is that kind of what it is? Like, what is the practical import of knowing the difference between Rangtong and Shentong, and how would that impact someone's life? Is that the kind of question that you're getting at there?
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. I think my register was a little less a little less impetuous. What's the point? I don't mean but I mean, no, I really mean, of course, yeah. Well, what I mean is, what are the implications in terms of that difference in view, not only for the practitioner, but I mean, does this affect how other teachings are presented, or Does it affect practice? Does it affect realization? What? And okay, sure. And downstream, for the present day, you had your Gelugpa associate say to you, "Oh, you're a Shentong person now." What does that mean? Other than having that particular philosophical view, how might that affect you
Exactly.
as a practitioner?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I mean, I'm just sort of as a practitioner, the thing with sort of having more of the Shentong view, let's say, is you're sort of, I would say it's kind of a really great counterbalance to, in a way, some sort of nihilism. Now, Buddha, he taught the two extremes. You've got nihilism, and then you've got sort of asserting reality as existing, right? So the middle way is a very thin line between those. But the thing is, I would say the Shentong's kind of really trying to focus on the really positive qualities that are available within our minds at any time of the day. So it's important to understand that, yes, there is impermanence, there is death, that everything is decaying, that all of these conditioned things are on their way out, including our bodies, including all those people we're attached to, But on the other hand, and the Buddha himself taught this in these sort of Buddha Nature Sutras, it is also really important to remember the Buddha nature qualities, because this is the counterbalance to getting too sort of nihilistic and sort of, too much suffering and too much nothing exists. It can get a little bit, you forget. But right now, even, within the mind, there are always these kind of qualities present. And in a way, this can be very uplifting. And it's very useful to remember that within all of us, there's that seed, there's that potential, but there's also those qualities which we can call upon at any time, in any situation. So, for example, the whole notion of generating bodhicitta or compassion for beings, doing that on a daily basis, that should really, what you're trying to do is bring out those qualities of the sort of essence of mind, which has that quality of concern, of care, of love, of compassion, of wisdom. And you're training your mind to sort of do that every day, because you're trying to remember those qualities. And so this is the thing, and this is why I would say maybe someone who's also got more of a sort of sense of Shentong and a more a sense of the Buddha nature, when things are quite tough or getting quite bad, we can go into that sort of really deep, profound resource of the mind and remember, for example, loneliness is a huge problem, I think, in, especially Western societies, but, I think everywhere with the advent of social media, and people feel often very disconnected from people, right? And so when people feel lonely, they get quite depressed, and I think, again, this is where the Buddha nature is actually very, very useful, because you're, with the bodhicitta and the Buddha nature kind of qualities, is that, you can go outside and you can see there are other human beings around, there are animals around. And in India, this is obviously, it's quite easy to do that. It's very much on show that, are experiencing perhaps lots of suffering and are kind of in a much worse situation than you. And, and you can also show love and compassion to people in very small ways. But I think just remembering those qualities of the mind, which is the Shentong view, is very useful in that respect on a very practical level. And you don't need to be a Buddhist to do it. Of course, you could be. It's just really sort of remembering that we all have sort of really these amazing potentials and abilities to have extremely amazing states of mind and care and love and compassion for people, and it's kind of really just bringing that out, when stuff starts getting quite tough, as it does,
Yeah, thank you. That's Taranatha's commentary on the Heart Sutra, published by Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. Yeah, thanks for going into that a bit. Thanks for going into that a bit. It's interesting to hear your reflections on the sorts of themes that text brought you into contact with very deeply. Yeah. Of course, since then,
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, actually, I probably didn't say much about what Taranatha said, though, which I could probably say a little bit on. So Taranatha was really talking about how there were certain parts of the Heart Sutra which were definitely pointing to these sort of Buddha nature qualities or the ultimate nature of mind. So he would just sort of kind of go through the text and sort of say, well, this, you know, shows that that is talking about Buddha nature, that is talking about, you know, the nature of mind, but without having the text in front of me. And it was quite a while ago since I did. I don't know if I could go into too much detail about it, but yeah.
No, thank you anyway for what you said. Of course, since then, that was some years ago. You've you know, published some more books, as you pointed out, and you've also started the website dakinitranslations.com.
Yeah.
So maybe we could talk about that, unless there are any, or and indeed any other important intellectual or spiritual waypoints up to that point. But I'm curious about dakinitranslations.com. Can you share a little bit the story behind that website and what it's all about?
Yes. Well, the thing is, because I think it was several reasons, and I do mention this in my introduction to the website, which is also on YouTube. But you know, again, I think that there was a combination of factors. You know, I'd had a sort of quite a, I guess you could call it a negative experience with you know, a teacher, and I sort of, you know, spoke about it. You know, I told people about it, and what happened as a result of that, you know, was actually in some ways quite difficult, because you know, you kind of get a bit sort of shunned by quite a lot of people in the community. Not everyone, but it's, you know, and people can read about this on the website as well. I have written about it, but you know, so that was one factor that I started to find that because of that experience and because I've spoken about it, that it was not so easy anymore for me to be, you know, people just wouldn't reply to my emails, or it would be very difficult to get things published. But it was never explicit, but, you know, funding was removed and all sorts of things like that. And I realized that all of a sudden these barriers were coming up, and it was very much coinciding with that. So, you know, although it wasn't always explicit, I think it was actually quite obvious that it was connected to that. And as I say, people who I'd known, who were previously very friendly and open before, just kind of completely just cut me off in a way. And that was very difficult. So that was one aspect. But the other aspect is I sort of also felt that the whole world of sort of publishing in Buddha Dharma, the translations, was actually quite male dominated, actually. And I know I wasn't alone in that. Of course, there are female academics who have managed to get professorships even, and they still will say that, you know, their work is often overlooked, it's not included, or in collections and so on. And so I felt also this sort of feeling that, you know, it was much more difficult as a woman, as a translator, particularly to get the work out there. And there was a lot of gatekeepers to these projects, you know, these kind of, who are predominantly men, and who, you know, and the projects themselves also, they sort of seem to have become huge, you know. I mean, I won't name names, but there are these projects that have, you know, huge kind of committees, editorial committees, and just masses of people, a lot of funding. And I also felt that in some ways, because of my own experience, when I put forward some research I did myself, which went through review processes, which by the end of it, not much really changed, that some of this was actually a real waste of time, actually. And it was very frustrating to have to face all these kind of gatekeepers and barriers. And then, you know, a lot of talk about translation. You have all these meetings over people discussing how to translate a word and end up talking about it for a month. I mean, you know, it's like, come on, you know, this is, you know, Marpa, the great translator, obviously never had to have this kind of level of analysis. Now, I understand it's good, like as an academic myself, who's been in that world, that is important. But I think if you have an academic background and you have a record of high quality research and scholarship, and you know how to do that, then I really don't think all that editorial committees and people talking about how to translate bodhicitta, for 2 weeks or whatever is actually necessary. So this was the other sort of real thing, which is I really wanted to sort of kind of bypass all of that, subvert all of that, and make the research and the translations available without having to go through all of that kind of process, but making sure it was reasonably high academic standard. But the other thing is I wanted it to also be an example of a woman who had set up a translation website, who had done it off her own initiative. And because if you look at the other translations websites that are out there, they are predominantly, well, I think all of them are run and set up by men. Yes. So there was an element of sort of showing that it's possible a woman can also do this. So there was that element to it. But there was also, I wanted to make Dharma translation and research just more attractive. I wanted to produce something which was not just for academics or practitioners, but was kind of hitting that kind of standard, let's say, of a sort of more academic approach, but which at the same time was speaking out more to a general audience of practitioners or people who were just more interested in it in a more general way, and presenting really interesting ideas that has come out of research that were just completely lost on a dusty shelf in a PhD thesis somewhere, bringing that out into the public sphere so that people could actually read that in a sort of very accessible way, in an attractive way, with images, with music, because one of the sort of signature pieces, if you like, of the Dakini Translations website, which people love, I mean, they tell me they love this. Like, it kind of started out as a little bit of a joke. And then I realized actually people love it, but also music, when combined with philosophy, it really opens up people's hearts and emotions. And actually, that's kind of what Dharma is supposed to do as well, right? So I really felt that by putting music there, it was another way to sort of try and get across what this article or this research or this text was about in a sort of non-written or non-verbal way, right? It's kind of, and actually this became very, very popular. People really enjoyed that aspect of it. And so I just carried on doing it because I love music. You see, I'm a huge music fan. I play the piano and the guitar. I love music basically. And I always, I just think, yeah, it's a very different medium to sort of touch people and to reach people, right? And so that was the other sort of driving factor of dakinitranslations.com, is I just wanted to make the Dharma not seem like some dusty, dry academic thing, but sort of kind of retain that sort of standard wherever possible. But also, to, as I say, give it that sort of female sort of face to it or edge to it, and the sort of something a little bit more artistic, let's say, or musical to it. So yeah, those are the sort of, and obviously to make it free. So the other thing is it's completely free. You don't have to pay for anything. And I also believe this is important when it comes to Dharma. I don't ask for any money. I don't sell anything. It's all basically based on people's donations. If they want to donate, they can donate. And I also think that changes the energy of something quite a lot, actually. Not selling things, particularly in Dharma, because, it's considered generally not that great to profit from Dharma. I mean, financial profit. So it's considered not to be something really you should try to do, is to get financial profit from the Dharma. Of course, covering your costs or whatever, that's different. Translators have to live and, have to eat. But, I think it's just this idea that it's a kind of a commercial thing. It's a profit thing. And so I think the thing is when people sell Dharma texts, it changes the energy quite a bit in a way. And that's why I think, for example, other, translation websites like Lotsawa House or Dharma eBooks, which is the 17th Karmapa's publications website, all those texts are free on there. And I think this explains why they're so popular and they're so well thought of, is because they are not selling things to people. And it's all, you can donate if you want, but if you don't want, it's fine. This is all available to you for free.
Yeah, very cool indeed. You know, I think anyone who visits dakinitranslations.com will straight away be struck, at least I was, by how much
Mm.
there is on there. There's a lot on there. And so,
Yeah.
you know,
Yes.
it's a lot of work. So I was
Yes, it
curious
is.
how you decide, how you select which works to translate, and if you could perhaps pull back the curtain a little bit on your process, both in terms of the research
Yes.
involved and maybe give us a sort of an outsider's view of your shoulder sketch of how you'd approach the translation process itself in broad terms.
Yes. Well, yes, it is a lot of work. I absolutely will say that. But and in a way, that's kind of like you say, it's one of how it's become very well known is people say it's just prolific, right? Because it's just one person, and in that respect, in some ways, I'm happy about that because the more content, the better. But I also think that I mean I have a huge passion for Dharma, and so it's like I almost feel like I should basically do something every single day on a translation or some research, and I should just write something every day. And I guess you could almost call it like an obsession, but it's. I see it more as a passion because I am very fortunate because I've built up this kind of background and skill set. And I live in India and I study here, but I have the time and the interest and also that skill set to actually do this. Now, it is not easy to do it. It requires a lot of hours and but without the passion for it, it's not possible. You can't produce that sort of thing every day or every other day if you just don't have that kind of interest and passion for it. And I think that is why that's how I approach it. So it's kind of as because I follow obviously the 17th Karmapa, so I like to write up his teachings because what I feel with the 7th, so this is what I'm working on at the moment. But so when someone like he is teaching, I like to write it up and I like to provide sources and footnotes and images and go off maybe and different tangents from those teachings which he hasn't covered, which then I find quite interesting. Like, for example, he mentioned this nun who was a student of the Buddha, who was one of the Buddha's best students. And so then I decided on my own to go off and do some more research on her. And I just thought, wow, this is kind of interesting. I'm going to share this with people because they may also not be aware of her. So that's sometimes it's very organic. It's not like a sort of, because although I do get asked to do work and I do get offers, can you do this? Can you, generally speaking, I'm not a kind of paid to work translator. It's much more organic. So if I see something that I think that's really interesting, I have a passion for, I would just do it. And if someone gives a teaching on a deity or something that I have the empowerment for, but that's the other thing. If we're talking about deities or Vajrayana or anything like that, or even sort of philosophical texts, if I don't have the transmission or the empowerment, or I don't have that connection to that particular deity or text, then I won't do it. So I've been asked sort of, for example, to do things for money. And I just said no, because either I don't have the connection with that teacher, I don't have any kind of devotion or connection or interest in that lineage or teacher, or I just don't have the empowerment for that deity, or I'm not really connected. And I think that's the difference between the kind of work that I'm doing, the translation work that I'm doing, is someone who's what maybe might be called a professional translator, is they will basically do work that they get paid to do. And if someone says, can you translate this text? I'll give you this amount for it. They say yes. And so that is not how I pick text or translate. So for me, it's really from the heart. It's from, am I really interested in this? Is this something I think other people will find really interested in it? And then I just do it, I publish it. And from that, if people donate from that, that's great. If they don't, they don't. But it's so far, it seems to be really working. It's very successful because I believe that sometimes when you do things that are sort of more from your heart or more sort of passion, or you kind of have a more, you're not doing it for money, it's a kind of a different energy to it in a way. It's sort of, it's quite different from someone who's been said, oh, I'll do this text, I'll pay you this amount, and they just produce it like a sort of, like almost like a worker, right? You're just not, and so that's the process. So it's in this situation, like recently, for example, it's very organic, but also with the 70 Karmapa teachings, sometimes the summaries and the write-ups on the sort of websites, they're kind of summaries, and they miss out lots of really interesting stuff. So I guess you could call I'm a bit of a dharma geek or something. I'm a bit of a geek about these things, and again, it's that academic background. It's just, I really feel, maybe not everyone, but certainly for me, I sort of really feel that when the 70 Karmapa gives a really great teaching, and he's done a lot of research on it, and he's gone into that level of detail to present it, I sort of feel it's really useful and important to have that in full, and to sort of really not have things missing, or it's kind of like maybe I'm a bit of a geek about that, but I think other people are too. So it's just sort of I just sort of feel that it's almost like an act of preservation in those cases. But other ways, for example, if I get an empowerment from a teacher and they teach a text, and I just thought, wow, that's a really interesting text, I'll just go and find the text in Tibetan, I'll read it, and I'll just do a translation of it, because I have the transmission and I got the empowerment, and I'll just do it, and I won't be asked to do it, and I'll just do it because I sort of feel I'm really interested in that text, but also I know other people who took that teaching and that empowerment are probably really interested in it too. And that's how it works. So it's very organic like that.
Very cool. I'd like to ask you a bit about, perhaps we can finish with, I mean, we could go on and on, I think it's so interesting what you're doing, but perhaps to finish, we could finish where we started. And Ian Baker, in that episode 100 of this podcast, had highlighted in particular your articles that investigated some of these female teachers of the famous Mahasiddhas who are not as known as well, right? And so a couple of the articles, the Unsung Heroes article and the Dakini's Truth article, are a couple of the ones that I think he was thinking of when he was saying that.
Yes.
Perhaps you could say a little something about those figures and that category of figure, and your interest in investigating them.
Yes. Well, first of all, I mean, Ian has been very supportive and encouraging of the work ever since dakinitranslations.com was set up. And, I really am grateful to him for that. He was kind of right there from the beginning in a way, as soon as I started writing and publishing on it. And so I'm very grateful that he mentions it. But on the other hand, he's very genuine. He really does. He tells me, he really, really enjoys that sort of work. And he really enjoys the fact that these issues are being brought up and being written about. So I'm very grateful to Ian for his interest and his support on this. And as I said, especially as I faced quite a lot of obstacles as well, when it was being set up, and people went out of their way to either ignore it or kind of diminish it or whatever, and so to have someone like that who's very supportive, it's really helpful. And so with these sorts of articles, I thought it was quite a natural place to put these sorts of articles on Dakini Translations, because the whole thing is a female-founded website. It's kind of a woman who's trying to sort of bypass all those obstacles and barriers, and it just made sense to have research and articles on women like that, who Miranda Shaw, for example, who, by the way, when I started writing about this and I started quoting some of her work, and even I was a little bit sort of, challenging some of the things she'd written. I mean, she wrote me a beautiful long email. She just said she loves the website. She's absolutely, and I was really supportive, and I was kind of, again, I was a little bit taken aback, because I was kind of like a big fan of her book, and so she wrote me this beautiful long email about how much she appreciated the work, the site, and the fact that these ideas again were being brought into the public domain. Because the thing with Miranda's book is it's an excellent book in terms of the ideas and looking at these female lineage teachers within Vajrayana, within Tantric Buddhism, who were actually sometimes teachers of these, really famous male yogis like Tilopa and Naropa, and but very rarely depicted in any of the paintings or the sort of refuge trees. And so I also wanted to sort of remember Miranda's work, bring out that work, bring out the ideas that but add to that, so add some more content to it, bring in some of the sort of, my own translational research on it, and just sort of, like build on it, I suppose. And she was very happy. She was very happy about that. She very much, and so that also kind of spurred me on as well. So when, she was encouraging and saying, this is great, I'm really happy you're doing this, that made me think, this is something I need to do more of. So for example, the latest post that I've done, it's very short, it's not going into a huge amount of detail, but it's on a nun who was one of the Buddha's best students. And she's not mentioned in Miranda Shaw's book as far as I'm aware. But it's it's a similar sort of kind of, if you like, agenda, if you call it. It's just trying to point it out more. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a website, it's called Congratulations, you have an all-male panel. Have you heard of this?
I've heard of, yes, I have. And Manal, right? Isn't it the thing?
Something like that. But anyway, it's kind of, so on the one hand, I think it's really important to keep a sense of humor, and it's really important to sort of, especially in the Vajrayana, there should always be this sense of, the view, never take anything too seriously, but with that sort of humorous side to it, but also to kind of really just remind people, like the sort of congratulations, you've got an all-male panel. I mean, the great thing about that, who set that website, it's actually quite funny. Obviously they did it to be funny, but it's actually making a really serious point as well, right? So they get people to send in the photos of these all-male panels, which have absolutely no women on them, even though there's lots of women in the field who could speak on them. And in a way, I kind of see it a little bit like that. So I'm kind of, whenever and wherever possible, when women are mentioned, and they're mentioned very fleetingly, but actually they had very interesting lives and they were very important in a way, I just sort of almost deliberately say, okay, now we're going to look at this woman because, she's been ignored basically. And that's not okay. But I try to do it in a sort of, kind of a fun way as well. And I sometimes put this, as I say, music choices that, for example, I did one on this Stulananda, who's like a very badly behaved nun, who the Buddha apparently made a lot of Vinaya rules because she was so badly behaved. I mean, I certainly wasn't aware of her until the 17th Karmapa mentioned her. And, and there's this in the text, it says, she's really like, got this huge bottom and things like that, so of course, it's not relevant, but it's good to bring these things out, that this is the kind of things that were said and written about. But to keep the humorous side, I did use Queen's Big Bottom Girls Make the World Go Round song, because I also think, as a sort of, if you're practicing Dharma and you're doing Vajrayana, of course, you always have to maintain a certain sense of lightness to things. So that's how I think, that's how I see it. So there's a serious message there, but also, it's not sort of too awfully serious, so it's kind of like, I try and balance it with sort of things like that, which I think is the all-male panel site does really well.
Yeah, that's very funny. I hadn't thought of it like that before, these lineage trees. It seems to be you're kind of saying that we could put those lineage trees on this congratulations, you've got an all-male panel site.
Yes, well, I have sent I have sent things to the all-male panel website because unfortunately within Tibetan Buddhism it is still very male dominated. I mean, many meetings you won't find a woman on the panel, especially if it's like a religious sort of meeting, and it's predominantly monks. But it is changing. And I think that, for example, Tibetans I know here, women I know here, who I think more and more women are sort of starting to notice these things more. Yeah, hang on a second. Like there's no women on that panel, and it's just kind of strange. It's starting to look strange now to them as well, because there are women in the community who could speak on those panels. And so I think, yeah, things are changing, but I also think it's good not to, to remember the view as well, and not sort of get too sort of serious or solid about it, because, and I think that's the key in a way, and that's not always so easy to do, to sort of walk that line of, making a serious point, but at the same time you're maintaining the view in some way.
That's a line you also walk a little bit with the name Dakini Translations, isn't it? I've seen you talk about that there's a bit of humor in that too. Perhaps you could, by way of closing, point to that, how that name itself actually has this kind of humor in it too.
Yes, I mean, because, obviously on the one hand, I wanted to get across, this is very female. The Dakini is like a sort of female name, and especially more and more these days, it's kind of thrown around a lot. You're a Dakini, she's a Dakini. And often it is like, I think this Khandro Rinpoche mentions, she's got a YouTube video. She says, what is a Khandro Dakini? She says, and actually it's not like this kind of pretty young woman who is like easy to get on with and popular. Actually Dakinis are sometimes really difficult. I mean, challenging, difficult. They are kind of right up there, as a mirror, sort of telling you this sort of situation, or being very honest or direct with wisdom, right? So that many people find Dakinis really awful. They are not, but the thing is, nowadays, of course, it gets sort of, as she said, people get, some lamas say, oh, she's young and pretty, she's a Dakini, and people love it, and they're sort of like, yeah, Dakini. So there's an element that I noticed this myself, and I wanted it to be a female name, but I also was kind of, trying to keep it sort of like as a funny thing, as a humorous thing, because of course, I'm British, right? So maybe not everyone's going to get that sort of subtle sort of irony side to it. And so, straight away people thought, oh, Adele is saying she's a Dakini. And actually, that was kind of the point in a way. It was kind of like I was kind of playing with that and sort of saying, actually, I'm not saying I'm a Dakini, but in a way, isn't it kind of funny that that's the assumption, that I'm using that word to apply to myself, because obviously we're in a culture now where everyone's applying this word to themselves, and everyone's kind of happy when someone says they're a Dakini, and it's often based on really superficial things like, how young they are, how pretty they are. And I just felt it was kind of being ironic. It was also being serious at the same time. It is a female website, but I also, maybe it's my British sense of humor or something, but I just felt that it was kind of a very what's the word, like I'm just trying to show that there's something funny about saying, this is Dakini Translation. So every time someone has to say that website name, it's like, oh yeah, it's on Dakini Translations, or it's, it's kind of playing with it in a bit. I'm trying to be a bit playful. So, when they quote it or they cite it, they have to say Dakini Translations. And I don't know why, I just thought that was kind of also quite funny. Because every time they talk about it or quote it, they have to say Dakini Translations. And I'm sure some people really don't like that. And I'm not doing it because I don't want people to like it. I just think there's something a little bit funny and humorous about it that is hopefully saying lots of things at the same time, which, has that kind of ironic side to it as well. I don't know. Do you get that? Do you get this sort of slightly ironic side to it?
Yeah, well, my website's called Guru Viking for very similar.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not foreign to the idea of slightly tongue in cheek, but also serious website.
Yes.
I'm very aware of that, and I'm also aware of the occasional way it rubs people up the wrong way, and people say, "Oh, you're a guru, are you?" I've had people say that to me too, but it's very rare. I think most people get get the kind of playfulness of my website title name.
Yes,
but
I certainly found it to be playful. Yeah,
you found it to be playful.
Yeah, I didn't sort of instantly think, oh, I felt there was a playfulness to it. But that's the thing. Dakinis, and that's the irony, is that Dakinis are supposed to be playful. So, although I wasn't saying it's a Dakini or I'm a Dakini, I was also thinking, but on the other hand,
but if you were,
if I were, yes, exactly. I would hope and expect that if a Dakini were running a translation website, that it would be very playful and as well.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, Adele, this has been so fascinating, learning about your life and work at dakinitranslation.com. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.